Well, today's the day if you're a Georgia fan. The annual G-Day game, Georgia's spring scrimmage that caps off this year's spring practice. Today, 4 o'clock, Athens, Georgia. It will be televised on ESPN2. And yes, Uncle Lou will be live streaming this afternoon for that game. We'll start the live stream around 3:30, 3:45, something like that. And we can all watch the Georgia spring game and talk about it together. If you're not a Georgia fan, that's fine. Come hang out with us anyway. We'll talk a lot of college football, not just Georgia spring game. We'll talk a lot of college football during that live stream this afternoon. A lot of teams already had their spring game. A lot more teams having their spring game today. And spring games wrapping up here over the next couple of weeks. And then we will be into the another version of the off season, I guess. You have a little bit of quiet time between signing day and spring practice. You have a little bit of quiet time now between spring games wrapping up and summer camps and summer workouts. You'll have a lot of transfer portal news over the next 30 days or so. The transfer portal window is now officially open. People can enter the transfer portal between now and April 30th, I believe. April 15th to April 30th, I think, is this year's transfer portal season, or when you're allowed to enter the portal. But what are we going to look for today in Georgia's spring game? Some of the stuff you look for every single year, at least me. This is how I watch spring games anyway. I like to see things or people we've never seen before. Whether that's incoming freshmen, whether that's transfers, whether that is new quarterbacks, which we have this year. We got a new offensive coordinator. I don't think you'll be able to watch today's spring game and then come away with a determination about what type or style of offense Mike Bobo is going to run during the season. You're going to see a lot of throwing today, I think, in the Georgia spring game for a couple of different reasons. If you go back over the last few spring games, that's just how it's been for Georgia and their spring games. Georgia doesn't like to run the ball a whole lot. You combine that with the fact that Georgia's got some injury situations going on at the running back position. Nothing major, but a couple of injuries at the running back position that's keeping a couple of running backs out of this game. So what does that mean? Well, we're going to see, obviously, a lot of Branson Robinson, true freshman last year that was kind of the third or fourth running back into the game in most games. An incoming freshman, Roderick Robinson. Those are really the two healthy running backs. Kendall Milton is out. Dejon Edwards has been dealing with a little bit of some injury issues. So as far as running the ball goes, you're going to see a lot of Branson Robinson and Roderick Robinson. Roderick Robinson, true freshman. This will be everyone's first opportunity to see him. He's a West Coast kid, so we didn't get to see him play high school really, at least not locally, not in person, that kind of thing. So this will be a lot of people's first look at that incoming running back from the West Coast, Roderick Robinson. And Branson Robinson impressed a lot of people last year too. And look, Georgia's running back situation, I'm not worried or concerned about Georgia's running back situation, but I do think it's fair to wonder or maybe even to think that this might be the worst Georgia running back situation, at least heading into a season, that we've had in a while. Now, I use the term worst subjectively. Georgia has had an unbelievable run of running backs going back really about over a decade now to when Todd Gurley and Keith Marshall first came in. You had Todd Gurley and Keith Marshall. You had Nick Chubb and Sony Michel. Then you had DeAndre Swift. We've had James Cook, Kenny McIntosh. And that's just to name a few. And never mind, the Elijah Holyfields and people like Georgia's had a really, really good run of running backs. And right now, Dejon Edwards is the most experienced running back of the bunch, but he's pretty much been like a third option at the running back his entire career. Kendall Milton's had a lot of promise, a lot of potential, but he's yet to make it through a season. Sort of been plagued by the injury bug. He's back. Branson Robinson, true freshman last year, again showed some promise, but didn't get to see a whole lot of him, at least not in terms of being one of Georgia's primary options at running back. And then you got the incoming freshman, Roderick Robinson, in addition to last year's incoming freshman, Andrew Paul, who blew his knee out last offseason, so didn't get to play last year, his freshman year. He's still out. He won't be playing today, but he's expected to be ready to go by the time the season starts. So I don't think Georgia's running back situation is bad. I don't think Georgia should be worried about their running back situation. But I also think it's fair to say that this is probably the most questions, at least, that you've had about the Georgia running back position heading into a season in a while. Sticking with the offense, of course, quarterbacks is going to be the main focus, I think, today for 99% of people who are watching this game and talking about this game. Georgia loses Stetson Bennett to the NFL. Comes down to basically Carson Beck or Brock Vandagriff. Gunnar Stockton is there too, but he's considered a super long shot at this point to win the starting job. Most people assume it's going to come down to Carson Beck or Brock Vandagriff. Both are fully healthy. You'll see a ton of both of them in today's game. And I do think this is an important day for both of these QBs for a variety of reasons. Obviously, both want to play well. Both want to impress the coaching staff. What we have to try to keep in mind as fans, and this is going to be, I'll admit this is hard for me to do. What we're seeing today is one of 15 practices that the coaches have seen over the last month. So we don't get to see the practices. We haven't seen Carson Beck and Brock Vandagriff play in a lot of actual games. Carson Beck played more than Brock last year. He was the number 2 last year, so he played quite a bit in the second half of games, including the national title game. Brock Vandagriff played much less than that. So this is going to be, as fans, really our first opportunity to see these guys go head-to-head for the starting position. Now, we've all watched spring games before, and you know how some of these rules are. You're not allowed to get within 3-4 feet of a quarterback, or they just blow the thing dead. When it comes to Brock Vandagriff, he brings more of a running aspect to the game than Carson Beck does, and that becomes hard to judge, I think, in a spring game. If protection breaks down on Brock Vandagriff and Georgia's defense gets a rusher around the edge, in a game situation, Brock Vandagriff, I believe, and most people believe, is more suited than Carson Beck to maybe escape that pressure, take off running, or even escape the pressure, roll out, hit a receiver downfield, that kind of thing. It's hard to see that in a spring game sometimes because the referees and the coaches are so quick to blow the whistle anytime someone gets anywhere near a QB. Carson Beck, on the other hand, is considered more of the gunslinging, sort of traditional pocket passing type of QB. Not that he can't run or move at all, he can, but Brock Vandagriff is clearly a better athlete with more mobility than Carson Beck, and it's hard for that to shine through in a spring game, I think. So you watch this game today, I think you're going to see a ton of passes from both of these quarterbacks. As far as who they'll be throwing the ball to, again, when it comes to spring games, we can name the obvious: Brock Bowers, Lad McConkey, Arian Smith, these receivers that we've seen for the last few years at Georgia. But when I watch a spring game, that's just not really what I look for. I mean, if in Georgia's spring game today, Brock Bowers has 1 catch for 4 yards, is anyone going to come away from the spring game going, man, I'm really concerned Brock Bowers only had 1 catch for 4 yards? No, we know what Brock Bowers is. We've seen what Brock Bowers can do. I don't really watch a spring game to try to come away wondering what I'm going to get from somebody like a Brock Bowers next year. So we're looking at the ones behind that, right? Again, the new faces. Oscar Delp, true freshman last year, 3rd on the depth chart behind Brock and Darnell. He'll get a lot of playing time today. Lawson Lucky has been getting a lot of hype in the spring practices with some of the things that have been reported as far as the way he's looked at practice this year. We get to see a lot of him today, a true freshman tight end. The 2 new wide receivers that Georgia brought in from the transfer portal, Ra Thomas and Dominic Lovett. Ra from Mississippi State, Dominic Lovett from Missouri. How do they fit in with Georgia as a team, with the offense, with the style, that kind of thing? As far as the offensive line goes, the offensive line in my mind is pretty much set outside of maybe one tackle position. Amarius Mims, and what's the other guy's name? I'm drawing a blank on the other guy's name now. Anyway, Georgia's offensive line is pretty much set. And again, when you watch these spring games, the average fan is not watching the spring game to evaluate the offensive line. Now, you can, there are some things you can get by watching the offensive line. Obviously, you don't want to have your quarterback sacked 10 times, like what happened in the Florida spring game, things like that. But I don't know that any questions about the offensive line in general or the tackle position in particular will necessarily be answered by watching today's spring game. Again, we have to remember as fans when we watch this, from the coach's perspective, This is one of 15 practices that they have seen over the last 30 days. As fans, this is all we've seen. So if you go back to last year's spring game as an example, Stetson Bennett was 15 of 35 throwing the ball in last year's spring game. Well, we saw how that worked out in terms of the regular season. Carson Beck looked a million times better than Stetson Bennett in last year's spring game. Again, last year's spring game was one practice out of 15 that we saw as fans, whereas the coaches saw all 15. The coaches never considered starting Carson Beck over Stetson Bennett just because Stetson Bennett had a bad spring game, right? So there's not going to be very many hard or fast, concrete determinations that can be made coming out of this spring game. But because this is the only thing we get to see as fans, a lot of conclusions are going to be drawn about what they see in today's spring game. And like I said, I'm as guilty of this as anybody else. There are very few people that I have noticed so far who are firmly in one camp or the other when it comes to Carson Beck or Brock Vandagriff. Not that there aren't people who prefer one or the other. There are. I've heard people say, I think Carson should get the job, or I hope Brock wins the job. I have heard people say that. But it's not as polarizing as some of the QB battles at UGA we've seen in the past, whether it was from Eason, from Fields, Stetson, JT Daniels. I don't get that vibe from Georgia fans when it comes to this year's quarterback competition. With that being said, that could change after today. If, as fans watching this game, we perceive one quarterback or the other to be vastly better than the other, you could have people that find themselves firmly in one camp or the other after today's game. But again, you've got to keep, and I'm telling myself this as much as I'm telling anybody else, we have to keep in the back of our mind the fact that this is one practice out of 15. If Brock Vandagriff comes out today and goes 30 for 30 with 4 touchdowns and 0 interceptions, and Carson goes 5 for 20 with 1 touchdown and 4 interceptions, well, what about yesterday's practice? Was it the exact opposite? We're seeing 1, the coaches are seeing 15. We'll see how the fans' perception of the quarterback situation at Georgia changes or not after today's scrimmage, but that's obviously like the marquee thing that people will be looking for. If you're watching the game on TV today, I'm sure the announcers are going to spend a ridiculous amount of time talking about Georgia's quarterback situation. Does anyone end up transferring out of that quarterback room after the spring game today? We mentioned the transfer portal a few minutes ago. It's open from now till April 30th. Georgia's got 3 scholarship quarterbacks. Carson Beck is in his 4th year. Brock Vandagriff is in his 3rd year. Gunnar Stockton is in his 2nd year. I don't think Gunnar Stockton is going to transfer. It seems to me, if that was the case, he would have transferred earlier, being sort of the 3rd guy down on the list. But I am curious if either Brock or Carson decides to enter the portal after today's spring practice or tomorrow or next week during this transfer portal window that's open now through April 30th. I hope that doesn't happen. We only have 3 scholarship QBs. Really, you'd prefer to have 4. We only have the 3. And if we lose one of those 3 scholarship QBs, you're really losing your backup at that point. Gunnar Stockton would become the backup, and you say, well, Gunnar Stockton's got a lot of potential. It's not the worst thing in the world for him to be the backup. That's true. But when you only have 2 QBs and the first one gets hurt, and then you're playing the second one, what then? And what do we know about Gunnar Stockton? He loves to run around. He loves contact. He loves to hit people. If we get to a point during the season where Gunnar Stockton is our starting QB because the starter got injured, there's no backup behind him, at least not a scholarship backup. So if Georgia loses either Brock or Carson to the transfer portal, that could be bad news if the starting quarterback ends up getting hurt during the season. So would Georgia go out and get a QB from the portal just to add depth on the roster to replace the one they lose? I don't know. And I'm not, if you'd asked me 6 months ago, I would have told you I'm pretty sure Georgia's going to lose one of their quarterbacks to the transfer portal, over a 50% chance. Right now, from things I've heard and read and hearing other people talk, I'm not at that 50% threshold. Not that one of them couldn't leave. Of course one of them could and might leave, but I would put it, at least how I feel, is under a 50% chance at this point that one of those 2 QBs transfers out. But we'll see. So I guess that's kind of it for the offense. Moving over to the defensive side of the ball, Not a lot of question marks this year on the defensive side of the ball, which is very different from last year, right? Heading into last year's spring game, Georgia had just lost like 7 of its defensive starters to the NFL and had a lot of starters to replace, a lot of bodies to replace on the two deep. Kind of the opposite this year. Georgia does lose Keely Ringo, cornerback. They lose Jalen Carter along the defensive line. That's really it. I mean, we lost Nolan Smith, but he got injured halfway through the season. Didn't play the second half of the season anyway. Lost Robert Beal, another outside linebacker, to graduation. So, but it's really Keely Ringo and Jalen Carter that you're looking at there. Kamari Lassiter was cornerback number 2, playing the opposite of side of Keely Ringo last year. He'll become cornerback 1 this year, so that leaves a second cornerback spot that needs to be filled. 2 or 3 guys kind of battling for that position. Again, I don't think it's a situation where, as fans, we'll be able to watch the game today and determine who is the better option for that second cornerback position. You kind of hope both of them play. Both of them play well. Nyland Green, Dalen Everett, Julian Humphrey. There's several. Georgia has recruited ridiculously well at the defensive back position over the last 2-3 cycles. So I'm not all that concerned about who ends up being the starter. Whoever ends up being the starter is going to be a pretty good player, in my opinion, because Georgia has stacked talent at the DB position over the last few years. At the safety position, Christopher Smith's another guy we lose. Christopher Smith, kind of like the Stetson Bennett of the defense. This guy was a 3-star, I believe. Not very hyped at all coming out of high school. A lot of Georgia fans didn't even know his name until 2 seasons ago when he intercepted that pass in the first game of the season against Clemson. But he played really, really well for Georgia the last 2 years, becoming kind of the quarterback of the defense back there. A veteran guy. Again, not the most talented guy on the field for sure, but rarely made a mistake. Seemed to be in the right place at the right time more times than not. You lose him, that does hurt a little. Now, Malachi Starks was the other safety last year. He was a true freshman, so he's kind of the veteran of the safety group this year as a true sophomore, with Christopher Smith moving on to the NFL. But again, this is a position where Georgia has just recruited at an insane level. Janelle Aguero, is that his name? I might be saying his name wrong. Aguero, I'm pretty sure is his last name, is a true freshman that a lot of people say it's going to be hard to keep him off the field. I don't know if he'll start. You got to remember, Georgia still has Tyke Smith on this roster. Tyke Smith's a guy that was an All-American 3 years ago at West Virginia, transfers to Georgia, gets hurt, and has kind of been battling to come back from that ever since. He's here. This is his last year in college. This is sort of his boom or bust year in terms of hoping to make it to the NFL, right? He's still there. Does he slot into one of those safety positions, or maybe the star position, which you got Javon Bullard coming back at the star, who was just an absolute beast last season. Really, from the middle of the season on, Javon Bullard emerged as one of Georgia's best players, regardless of position, regardless of offense or defense. He was just a superstar last year. He's back. Do they keep him at star? Do they move him to one of the safety spots and put somebody else at the star? The issue for Georgia in the secondary is definitely not a talent issue. It's kind of it's almost like a chess piece issue. Which piece do you put where for maximum impact, right? Obviously, Javon Bullard's a guy that's got to be on the field. That's not a question. It's not a question of whether or not Javon Bullard is going to start. Maybe you have a question about whether or not he starts at star or potentially one of the safety positions. But he's in there. Malachi Starks is in there. Kamari Lassiter is in there. Those are 3 starters in the secondary. You got to figure out the other safety spot. You got to figure out the other corner spot. But again, there's just so much. I didn't even mention Smoke Bowie, who we bring in out of the transfer portal. I believe it was 5-star coming out of high school 2 classes ago. Transferred out after his freshman year. He's now at Georgia. Super talented kid. Does Georgia find a spot for him to sort of slot him in? We'll see. Along the defensive line, there's nobody on Georgia's team that's the next Jalen Carter. There's not. Georgia was extremely blessed at that position. Lose Jordan Davis, and then you backfill him with Jalen Carter. I mean, that's just insane. I love Georgia's defensive line, and I think Georgia's defensive line as a whole May be better than it was last year, but there's no individual defensive lineman, defensive tackle, nose guard, whatever you want to call it, that is the next Jalen Carter. That player doesn't exist on this team. Now, Bear Alexander is really, really good, and maybe he grows into that. Maybe he grows into that. He looked really good at times last year in kind of a backup role. When you look at Georgia's defense and you try to tell me like who are the 11 starters from last year, that's almost irrelevant. Georgia has stockpiled talent, especially on the defensive line, or especially on the defensive side of the ball, at such a ridiculous level that really Georgia's got, in any given game or year, Georgia's got about 17 or 18 starters on defense. Michael Williams is a great example of this. He was a true freshman last year, an outside linebacker slash rushing defensive end, whatever you want to call him. He started against Oregon, the first game of the year. There were other games throughout the season where he didn't start. But he played a ton in every single game, and that's the case with a lot of positions at UGA. You go back a couple of years, the inside linebacker position when Georgia had, what was it, Nakobe Dean, Quay Walker, and Channing Tindall. Well, we only played 2 inside linebackers at a time, but those are 3 NFL inside linebackers. They're all in the NFL now. You just rotated them in and out. Georgia's done this on the defensive line. We talked about Jalen Carter. Jalen Carter played about half the snaps most games. When he came out, Bear Davis was the guy that, Bear Alexander was the guy that went in. Very little drop off. Very little drop off. And that's the case with Georgia at a lot of positions. They're able to rotate these people in and out on defense with very little or no drop off at all. And that, of course, has been a huge benefit to Georgia, especially in the second half of games. And one of the things that separates teams like Georgia from maybe some other top 10 teams, a team like Tennessee comes to mind, and this isn't a shot at Tennessee. Tennessee fans will tell you this. Tennessee's starting 11 on defense is okay. It's not that bad. But the combination of not enough quality depth and then, of course, the style of offense they run leads Tennessee's defense to sometimes break down over the course of a game, particularly in second halves. And I'm not taking a shot at Tennessee. Again, this is something that Tennessee coaches and Tennessee fans know has been an issue, and have made efforts to address that through recruiting and transfer portal, depth on defense. That's a luxury Georgia has that a lot of teams don't have. So when you talk about who are Georgia's starting 11 going to be on defense, that's an impossible question to answer a lot of times, even in week 6, 7, or 8 of the season. Because Georgia's not going to always start the same 11. And even the 11 that start, they're going to play 4 or 5 plays, and then half of them are going to come out, and a different 5 or 6 guys are going to go in. They just, the way they're able to rotate in and out on defense is ridiculous. But Georgia's got some great linebackers they signed in this class that we'll get to see for the first time today. As far as my questions about Georgia's defense heading into next season, I'd like to see a dominant edge pass rusher. I feel like we didn't really have that last year. Nolan Smith was as close as we had to that. And again, he got injured halfway through the season, unable to play the rest of the year. But Robert Beal was kind of like a Christopher Smith, a guy that's been there 5 or 6 years, nowhere near the most talented player at his position, but rarely made any boneheaded mistakes. He just didn't have like that next level talent that you look for. Chaz Chambliss is a guy on the outside that I really have not been all that impressed with over the last couple of years. He's back. Maybe he gets a little bit better. And again, some younger guys, whether you're talking about true freshmen or second-year guys, Marvin Jones Jr. Comes to mind. Darius Smith. There's some other guys that I think will give an opportunity this year to sort of step up at that pass, outside pass rush position. Michael Williams is probably going to be the best we have this year. And he, like I said, last year at times he looked really, really good. True freshman, started about half the games, played in every game. He's going to be really, really good. So I'd like to see Georgia establish a dominant outside presence in terms of pass rush. Defensive line, I don't have any questions about, even though we lose Jalen Carter. Warren Brinson looked amazing. The last 3 or 4 games of the season. Last year he's back. I talked about Bear Alexander. Already Zion Logue. I mean, the list just goes on and on. There's 4 or 5 that Georgia can rotate in and out. The inside linebacker position, they all come back, led by Pop Johnson, Jamon Dumas Johnson. They call him Pop Johnson. Xavier Sori. It's Smile Munden. Smile Munden may end up being the best inside linebacker on the team this year. Pop Johnson gets a lot of the sort of publicity. I don't know. I liked what I saw from Smile Munden last year. He may end up having a breakout year at inside linebacker, but we'll see. I don't have any questions about the inside linebacker, and I already talked about the secondary. There are some questions in terms of who may start or whatever, but in terms of how the secondary is going to be, I've got no issues. Georgia's going to have an absolute elite defense again this year. You're talking about top 5 across the board, no matter what category you want to look at. I'm willing to bet Georgia will have a top 5 rush defense, top 5 pass defense, top 5 scoring defense, all the major factors that you look for a defense. Georgia's going to be on top of the college football world yet again when it comes to that defense. Most questions, admittedly, are offensive for Georgia this year. Brand new quarterback, brand new offensive coordinator, several new pieces at the wide receiver position. So kind of see how it all comes together. And a little bit of inexperience at the running back position. I mean, Kendall Milton's got a ton of experience, but has, so far he's just not been able to stay healthy in 3 years at Georgia. And he's currently hurt again, not playing today. Dejon Edwards has been probably the most consistent and reliable of the running backs currently on Georgia's roster, but probably overall the least talented. And again, it's not a shot at Dejon Edwards because the kid's really, really good, and he's going to play a lot, and he's earned that. But in terms of overall talent and potential, I mean, Kendall Milton is above that. The young guys, Branson Robinson, Roderick Robinson, Andrew Paul, they're all above that in terms of potential and overall talent. But so we'll see. We'll see. But the game comes on at 4, ESPN 2. I'll start the stream around 3:30. Hope to see a lot of you there. We'll talk some college football. But until then, though, have a good morning.